But at lunchtime it will still be largely cloudy with a few residual showers and rather chilly in a brisk westerly breeze.
The best of the afternoon sunshine will be for Northern Ireland, Wales and the Midlands, with showers elsewhere. And that's how the weather is shaping up for this Monday.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, calls for the Chancellor to scrap his tax rises this year will examine the chance of a U-turn. And as Russia allegedly seeks Chinese help in Putin's war of aggression, we'll explore what China will choose and how that will affect us in Britain. And UK refugee policy, have we got it right? All that and more coming up after your morning headlines.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. The fourth round of talks between Ukraine and Russia is taking place today. The Ukrainian presidential advisor says the focus is on achieving a ceasefire, troop withdrawals and security guarantees for Ukraine. He also says Ukraine's position remains unchanged in insisting on a ceasefire before talks on future relations could happen. Ukraine's president says it's only a matter of time before Russian missiles hit a NATO nation. Volodymyr Zelensky issued the warning after 35 people were killed yesterday at a Ukrainian military base near the Polish border. Officials also said the Antonov aircraft plant, makers of the world's largest plane, has been shelled by Russian forces. President Zelensky renewed his calls for NATO to implement a no-fly zone over his country.
And now I repeat again, if you do not close our skies, it is only a matter of time before Russian missiles fall on your territory, on the territory of NATO and on the homes of citizens of NATO countries. American journalist Brent Renaud was killed today in Kiev region. His colleague is injured. It was a deliberate attack by the Russian military. They knew what they were doing, but not everyone in the West seems to know what they're doing.
A number of unnamed US officials have told multiple news organisations that Russia has asked China for military equipment to use in its invasion of Ukraine. The Chinese embassy in the US says it wasn't aware of the request. The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned Beijing it would absolutely face consequences if it helped Moscow. The government's Homes for Ukraine scheme, which allows people in the UK to offer spare rooms to Ukrainians fleeing the conflict, that starts today. The government's offering £350 a month to anyone who opens up their home rent-free for at least 6 months. Those offering accommodation will be vetted and applicants will face security checks. 21 Ukrainian children have arrived in England to receive cancer treatment on the NHS. The patients and their immediate family flew in from Poland last night and they're going to be assessed by doctors. The Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, says although the children have been given 6-month visas initially, these will be extended to at least 3 years. You're now up to date on GB News on your TV, online and radio. Now let's head to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, US intelligence believes that Russia has issued a request for military aid from China. The two countries have grown closer in recent years, publicly proclaiming a friendship of, quote, no limits and no forbidden areas of cooperation. Well, since the invasion, China has come under pressure, global pressure, to denounce its ally, with the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan to meet China's top diplomat Yang Jieqi in Rome today. The US is warning China it will face, quote, consequences if it assists Russia in evading US sanctions. Well, let's explore the wider relationship now between Russia and the US with Professor Steve Sang, director of the SOAS China Institute. And first of all, we're looking at Russia. We're looking at how Russia has been responding to a lot of these sanctions, especially over the last 2 weeks. And there's been many reports that within Russia, there has been Chinese technology stepping up to the plate, filling in things like Apple Pay, like credit cards. To what extent is Chinese technology filling the gap left by Western technology in Russia today?
Well, the Chinese government is committed to be as helpful to Russia under Putin as possible, but the Chinese are not willing to go to the extent that they will themselves be subjected to secondary sanctions. So when you're talking about the making of Alipay available to the Russians, that is something which doesn't appear to be on a sanction list, and therefore the Chinese are happy to provide that. But in terms of some of the financial services which are clearly subjected to sanctions, the Chinese have been actually a lot more cautious.
That's interesting. So the Chinese government working sort of within parameters of what they see as what the West might find acceptable or not. So I presume, therefore, that the Chinese government wouldn't be countenancing military aid to Russia at this moment in time.
My sense is that the Chinese government is unlikely to provide military equipment to Russia at this point, particularly if Jake Sullivan made it very, very clear to Yang Jieqi that this will attract significant American secondary sanctions against China. If the Chinese think that they can get away with any supply without attracting secondary sanctions, then I think they will provide that help to Russia. This one is going to be a difficult one for them.
It's interesting that it seems that that China might be listening more to America today, because there has been a lot of reporting over the previous few weeks and even months that an increasing separation between East and West is developing, sort of two spheres of influence, one in the democratic world in the West and the autocratic world in the East. And it seems that those have been growing apart recently. But it's your assessment that there are still those lines of communication, that relationship, that East-West relationship still matters?
Well, there are still communications between China and the United States and the rest of the so-called the West. We have to bear in mind that it is not so much a matter of China listening to the Americans and following American requests or demands. It's a matter of Chinese calculation of what Chinese interests are. And the most important and basic interest of China for 2022 is for Xi Jinping to succeed himself into a third term of office. and he wouldn't want to take risk of attracting American secondary sanctions. So it is not because of American persuasion. It is because of domestic and personal political calculations that I don't think Xi Jinping will want to bust Western sanction against Russia and therefore attract sanction against China, which will then force China into a bipolar world, which China doesn't want to find itself in that situation.
That's interesting, because a lot of commentators sort of are looking towards China as seeing as it wants to be sort of that great power in this two sort of bipolar world that you speak of. But I wonder if what's going on in Ukraine is actually changing the assessment now. Several weeks ago, people were assuming that if Russia has a sweeping victory in Ukraine, that might embolden China to perhaps turn its sights on somewhere like Taiwan. Perhaps the West being so united in its response and these unprecedented sanctions coming down might warn China away from being quite so imperialist.
Well, it certainly will make China take more time before it will embark on any military adventure over Taiwan. But here, the real issue is that both Xi Jinping and Putin miscalculated before the Russian invasion. I think they both thought that it would be quick and easy. They both believe in the superiority of their system, so they had no reason to assume that the Russian military would fail and that the Ukrainians would put up such a heroic fight. Now, in terms of why the Chinese really don't want to get back into a Cold War bipolar world, it's because Xi Jinping doesn't really want that kind of situation. What he wanted is China becoming the dominant power in the world as a whole, not as the dominant power in one of the two blocks in the world. So the bifurcation of the world as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not in China's interest. That is not what they wanted to do.
That's really interesting there. China seeing itself as wanting to have that greater regional influence, but not that new Cold War brewing. Well, it'll be a fascinating one to watch as time goes by. But Professor Steve Tsang, Director of the SOAS China Institute, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Interesting to talk through those issues there. Now, turning to the cost of living, as the war and associated sanctions start to push up prices here in the UK further still, the government is under considerable pressure to act. Next week, the Chancellor is to deliver his spring statement, a fiscal event that is expected to further address the pinch so many people are feeling. One big question, however, that so far the government has refused to bend to is, will the Chancellor push ahead with his planned national insurance tax rise? The tax hike will see a worker on £20,000 a year pay an extra £130, while someone on £50,000 a year will pay £505 more every year. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Harry Phone, Campaigns Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. Welcome to the programme. And I suppose that those numbers that I was just talking about there, that's just what the employee pays. Another considerable part of this is what the employer pays, because this tax hike will fall on both employees and employers at a time when we're really feeling a pinch, both for households, but for businesses too.
Well, good morning, Tom, and thank you for having me on. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not just the employees' national insurance, which I believe the Financial Times back in January said that the average employee will be paying about £400 or losing £400 from their income. But it's also the employer's national insurance, which is effectively a tax on jobs. It's another cost that the entrepreneurs and businesses are having to bear. Already, you know, they're bearing plenty of those. And it's a very interesting situation we find ourselves in at the moment. You know, the tax burden is at a 70-year high. We're seeing, you know, rising fuel costs. Council tax was reported the other day. The Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy Group expects that to go up by 3.5% or £65 on average for consumers. So this national insurance hike comes at a really bad time for both, you know, consumers and businesses. And one would hope that the Chancellor will at least postpone this rise at his spring statement.
There's certainly a lot of pressure in the media and on Conservative backbenches for him to do that. I wonder, Is it just too late? This is a tax rise that is set to come in just mere weeks' time. Turning around now might not be, given we know how much of a Goliath the government can be, how inefficient the government can be sometimes, might the Chancellor be more tempted next week to apply targeted benefits, perhaps, government spending, rather than reducing government tax rises?
Yes, I think unfortunately you could be right. I mean, we've already seen the people in bands A to D with their council tax will receive £150 rebate. Similarly, the Chancellor is doing this sort of £200 loans with energy bills. So, I mean, as I said, the average employee is going to lose about £400 because of the national insurance rise. It does seem a bit silly that you're sort of taking with one hand and then giving back with the other. I mean, the question is sort of why do it in the first place? But you spoke there about government inefficiency, and I think what really irks me, and I suspect will irk many of your viewers, is that the government, okay, we have had a tough couple of years with COVID and everything else that has happened, but why is government's first inclination when it needs to raise money to dip into our pockets? Why does it never look at a policy we're very fond of, which is save to spend? This is looking for savings elsewhere in government expenditure, and we know through our own research that the government wastes billions, if not tens of billions of pounds every year. If it were to ramp up its efficiency, eradicate wasteful spending, then it wouldn't need to hike national insurers, particularly at a time like this, when it probably is the worst possible time to be hiking taxes, especially as many households are struggling to make ends meet every month.
Certainly, it does seem that this is going to be a particular political problem, even though it may well be too late now to turn around. It's hard to know how quickly the Treasury can respond to something like this, although it must be said, during the early COVID days, some government programmes were generated pretty darn quickly. I wonder, though, taking a broader picture of the economy, what should the government be looking to do to help quell inflation? Inflation now expected in some eyes to reach an eye-watering 10%, perhaps double figures by next year.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other thing. Inflation is very much a stealth tax, which possibly, dwarfs all the other ones. It's especially when people's wages aren't going up at the same rate. And we may well see, stagflation. This is when prices are increasing, but actually the economy is contracting. I mean, on the one hand, you could say the government needs to stop printing money, but given what's happened in recent years, they have almost sort of been forced into that position. But the best way you can solve this crisis is you've got to get the spending under control, and you've got to grow the economy. You can grow your way out of this problem. Britain, the government still runs a budget deficit every year. We need to stop that happening. We're at, our national debt is at £2.3 trillion. And the way you grow the economy is by cutting red tape and cutting taxes. I think it was Winston Churchill who, effectively said, you cannot tax a nation into prosperity, because all taxes do is they stifle entrepreneurs and they don't encourage people to start businesses. People, particularly on higher incomes, just stop working when their marginal tax rate becomes so high. So the government needs to look at growing the economy, and the way it does that, cut taxes, cut red tape, and that will get Britain booming again and recovered from the pandemic in plenty of time.
Now, of course, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister both love to say that the UK was the fastest growing G7 economy last year. It's true, it was, although the projections for future years do not look quite so rosy. I wonder if politicians, too many politicians at the moment, are looking backwards rather than looking forwards, because it's all very well and good to say we grew quickly last year, when looking ahead, if taxes are being raised on families and businesses, if vital reforms are being watered down, if we can't build any houses, if we can't do a lot of the things that help the growth rate, might this government unstick itself?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite interesting. We've actually got a Labour opposition calling for tax cuts. And even, I think I saw the Liberal Democrats today calling for a reduction in VAT. I mean, let's not forget, we did some research recently. The average household in its lifetime will pay £1.1 million in taxes. I mean, think of all the things that, they could buy with that money. And that's all money that actually ends up going into the hands of the government. And as we said, we know the government isn't efficient in the way it spends money. You mentioned, that politicians have been quick to say we've had the fastest recovery from the pandemic, but that was only really because the crash we took on the economy was so much greater than everyone else's that we're only just getting back to where we were before it all started. What we have seen in this country in in the past is that, things like corporation tax. Corporation tax used to be at about 60%, I think it was, back in the 1950s. It's steadily come down over the years. But actually what's happened is we've seen the amount of unemployment has decreased, but yet the receipts, the revenue from corporation tax has increased. Similarly, the top rate of tax used to be 50%. It went down to 45%. People, were screaming that, this was, helping the rich and it was going to be negative to the country. What actually happened? The receipts went up from lowering the tax. So, as I say, you cannot tax a nation into prosperity. We need a vibrant, thriving economy, and the way you do that is by easing the tax burden on hardworking people.
It's interesting, the Prime Minister used to mention the Laffer curve quite a lot when he was campaigning to become Tory party leader, that economic principle that shows some taxes, when cut, can increase revenue, as you were saying. He doesn't seem to mention that so much now. Perhaps he needs to rediscover some of that more libertarian principle that brought him to the office in which he sits now. It'll be interesting to watch what happens in the Spring Statement next week. But for now, Harry Phone, campaigns manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, thanks for joining us this morning and talking through those important issues. Now, homes across the country are being urged to welcome Ukrainian refugees, as well as the war intensifies, leaving millions of people displaced. In an unusual move, the UK government has launched a Homes for Ukraine initiative and will offer those households £350 a month that choose to take in Ukrainian refugees. This comes as Wales and Scotland, those two governments, pledged to become super sponsors for Ukrainian refugees, suggesting they take in 3,000 and 1,000 apiece. Well, let's talk through this whole issue now with Rakib Ehsan, the research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. First of all, is the detail of this plan, the detail that came out in the last few days, the £350 a month for families to take in refugees, was this broadly expected? And why did it take 2 weeks to come about?
Well, the government is presenting this, Tom, as somewhat of a innovative initiative. I'm not so sure. The reality of the matter is that financial capacity and accommodation capacity differs vastly across British society. So to have a standardised payment of this nature, monthly assistance of £350, I'm not sure it's been particularly well thought through. And I think more generally, Tom, there is a push for the hyper liberalisation of processes in order to bring Ukrainian refugees to the UK. But I think we should really err on the side of caution to ensure that the proper systems are in place, make sure there are appropriate safeguarding measures, and that we have a very robust strategy in order to ensure the facilitation of the social, culture and economic integration of newcomers coming to the UK.
There seems to be a political consensus on this point that visas are the right way to go, unlike in the EU, where Poland has taken in over 1 million people with no visas, Germany over 100,000 people with no visas. The United Kingdom, we're looking at perhaps tens of thousands of people, but with those security checks and with those visas. As I say, there's a cross-party consensus on that. But does it look like the UK, one of the richest countries in not only Europe, but the world, is not going to be stepping up as much as some other countries?
Well, I think there, Tom, we have to add a bit of nuance to the debate. We are one of the most advanced industrialized societies in the world, but the story of refugee resettlement in the UK is one of unfairness. So recent analysis shows that 1 in 4 asylum seekers in the UK are housed in just 10 local authorities. So we're talking about your Hartlepools, Middlesbroughs, Rochdales, Stoke-on-Trent, Stockton-on-Tees, and also deprived inner city areas in Glasgow and Cardiff. While 42% of asylum seekers in the UK are rehomed in the north of England, excluding London, that figure drops all the way to 6.5% for southern England. So the reality of the matter is our refugee dispersal system in the UK is anything but fair. And I think it's time that people realise that it's actually those Brexit voting, relatively deprived local authorities that really roll their sleeves up and do more than their fair share when it comes to rehoming refugees, while wealthier areas don't quite do their bit.
Is an absolutely fascinating point. That sometimes those areas, and many of those areas you mention, I hear so often by so many commentators being disparaged as if they're backwards looking. But these are the areas that are actually taking the most refugees. I wonder if in this policy, this sort of sponsorship route with a flashy website popping up where you can open your home, but potentially this new way of accepting refugees into the country might have the opportunity to turn that around. All of the virtue signalling people who live in the southeast, who up until now have taken a small number of refugees, well, they'll be able to get onto that website and step up to the plate.
Well, let's see. They're more likely to have that accommodation capacity to do so. As I've mentioned in some of my writings, it tends to be middle class, pro-Remain, Liberal Democrat voting individuals in the UK who are most supportive of the liberalisation of refugee resettlement processes. But as you see, that those local authorities could be doing a lot more. Perhaps this humanitarian sponsorship approach, it can allow for a more decentralised approach to refugee resettlement, which is fairer. But saying that, as I said before, Tom, we need to ensure that these systems are not vulnerable to exploitation and that the appropriate safeguarding measures are in place to ensure that all the systems are functioning accordingly.
It is interesting that last week the Prime Minister seemed to mention the need for security in and around these visas, wondering perhaps if the Russians may exploit a visa-free route. We know the Russians have carried out chemical attacks on the streets of Britain in the past. Is it a genuine concern, do you think, that were we to go for a visa-free route, that might be seen as a way to attack Britain by Vladimir Putin?
Well, ultimately, Tom, I think that's generally why I'm quite cautious when it comes to the visa-free approach. I think that when it comes to these kind of matters, we really should err on the side of public security. I think there's no harm having systems in a system of checks and balances in place to ensure that we prioritise security in the right way when it comes to refugee resettlement. And on top of that, we need to also ensure that we have a robust integration strategy in place. I think that a point that many people are overlooking is that Ukraine is a relatively homogeneous society in Eastern Europe. And we're now essentially talking about integrating
It's interesting. Sorry, I think we just dropped your line for a few seconds there, but just finally, in the final 20 seconds of this programme, I suppose it's important that we look at this issue in terms of geography as well as wealth. A lot of people want to stay very close to Ukraine in that region.
No, absolutely. I think that when it comes to cultural compatibility, as I was making that point before, Britain is a very, inner city areas of Glasgow and Cardiff, a number of post-industrial towns, they're very different to much of Ukraine. So there may be a greater familiarity for Ukrainian refugees when it comes to those neighbouring countries.
Well, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, thank you for fitting that point into just 20 seconds there. We've run to the end of the programme, but we always appreciate talking to you there. Of course, Dr. Rakib Ehsan, Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and author of forthcoming book, Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. Thank you for joining us here on The Briefing. Well, coming up, it's To the Point with Patrick Christie's and Inaya Florin Iman. But first, here's the weather.
We're looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking a bit mixed with showers for some, but blue skies and sunshine for others. Let's take a look at the details. Well, there may be one or two showers across southwest England, especially for Devon and Dorset, but most places should be dry with variable cloud and some sunny spells.
A greater chance of catching a shower across southeast England, especially to the south of London. Temperatures up to 12 Celsius by midday.
Much of Wales will be bathed in blue skies and spring sunshine, and with light winds, it should feel very pleasant if you're out and about.
Some areas of cloud and maybe the odd shower across the South Midlands, but for the vast majority of people it will be dry with the best of the sunshine towards Shropshire and Staffordshire.
At lunchtime, we also